have an option to use live captions and subtitles, and these can be switched on by any individual user, and only you will be able to see the captions as they won't appear for the whole group. As I say, any questions can be put to the speakers by using the chat function, or we'll be able to pick some up during the Q&A session directly. There's going to be an evaluation form at the end of the session, and we'll put that within the link during the last 5 minutes. If you can complete this before leaving, it will be really useful for when the Avon and Somerset Safeguarding Partnerships plan their future events to support Stop Adult Abuse Week. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Natalie Keeley. Natalie is the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership Training Officer and who will be running this session with us today. Over to you, Nat.
Thanks very much, Olwen. Really appreciate that introduction. So as Olwen touched on, the theme that we're going to focus on today is around self-neglect. Please feel free to call me Nat Keeley. Most people that know me across certainly Bristol and other partnership areas would call me that. So in terms of the presentation, it's going to take the form of around a 45-minute presentation with the use of slides that I will talk to. And as Olwen touched on, there'll be an informal, non-recorded question and answer session at the end. But please feel free, as Olwen said, to pop questions in the chat as we go along, because I'm mindful people might think of things as we generate kind of thought processes throughout the slide movement. So before I move on to thinking about any content, I always like to open any form of webinar or training with a group safety agreement. So thinking about how we begin to think about keeping ourselves safe throughout the session and thinking about how we look after ourselves with regards to a self-care reminder. So just to recognise, when we discuss safeguarding adult themes, and today's one will be around self-neglect, as we've touched on, this could potentially have an impact on us. It could be triggering at any point, either due to our professional or our lived experience. So just a reminder, if you feel that the session is having an impact on you, please step away. Your videos and your mute buttons are on already, but step away, decompress, and please come back if you feel able to rejoin us with the session. And just think about self-care and self-support routes for us available after the session. So family and friends, peers, colleagues and managers, and most of us will have some form of occupational health structure within our organisational setting or an employee assistance programme. So please use those if you find that there's an impact. So what are we looking to cover in terms of the aims and objectives of the webinar today, just to manage some expectations? So firstly, we're going to focus in on who can be affected by self-neglect and the complexity of that, and we'll break some of that down within the slides. We're then going to focus on what we would see nationally as good practice. So that could be across all of our areas, not just for Bristol, with regards to actually supporting adults with self-neglect issues. And we will be looking at a case study example at the end of the session. So I've utilised a Somerset Safeguarding Adult Review, or SAAW, with the pseudonym of Matthew 2021. So just again, a self-care reminder, particularly for those Somerset colleagues that have joined us today, this will be a lived experience case study that we use as a result of that SAAW. So just take particular attention and self-care with yourselves. Just to touch on with regards to the case study example for Matthew's SAAW example, I will be using Slido polls, but I will walk.
You're on mute.
Natalie, you've gone on to mute.
How long have I been on mute, Olwen?
Just a couple of seconds.
Okay, thank you. So just to reiterate, with the case study example, it's a Somerset SAAW with the pseudonym of Matthew 2021. And just a reminder from my Somerset colleagues around self-care, particularly given the fact that this is a lived experience example. And I was just explaining that we will be using Slido polls, which is an interactive approach, but those are anonymous. So please feel free to give that honest thoughts and feedback within those interactive bits of the session. And then, as Olwen touched on in the introductions, and I've suggested, we'll have an informal question and answer session after the webinar presentation. Okay, so moving on to the first slide, thinking about how we define self-neglect. So when I looked at this in research and practice, there's actually no national statutory definition of self-neglect, but actually there are two recognised and defined kind of definitions that are regarded by most professionals across the safeguarding adult system. So the first one you'll see on the screen there is the Gibbons definition from 2006. So self-neglect defined as the inability whether that's intentional or non-intentional, to maintain a socially and culturally accepted standard of self-care, with the potential for serious consequences to the health and well-being of the self-neglector, so the adult in question, and perhaps even to their community. And then the second definition you can see there is from the Care Act guidance, so defining that self-neglect is a wide range of behaviour, neglecting to care for one's personal hygiene, health or surroundings, and includes behaviour such as hoarding. So you'll see there from the Gibbons definition that highlights not just the impact on the adult that may be experiencing those self-neglect issues or needs, but also the wider impact on family and friends around that particular adult, and in fact the community, that wider impact on the community. So we know that self-neglect can occur across the lifespan for adults, so adults of all ages, but particularly happens nationally and more prevalent in our elder populations within our community. So the statistic you can see in grey on the screen, so 31.8% of safeguarding adult cases nationally were identified as self-neglect. So just to highlight where that statistic comes from, it comes from the Sorry, was someone talking or shall I pause? Can people still hear me? Okay, I will continue. So that statistic comes from the collection of data from our local safeguarding adult boards nationally. So the government collect that data from our local safeguarding boards or partnerships. And that data specifically comes from the period of 2018 through to 2020. The data is collected biannually by the government. So the next national report statistics that we would be due would be in 2023 and would span the period of 2020 to 2022. It's worth considering the fact that the period in which that statistic comes from will obviously have been the period of COVID and the pandemic and the experiences of adults throughout that period. So through COVID, thinking about increased periods of isolation, increased deprivation and poverty for adults, increased loss throughout that period, and certainly an impact on mental health of adults in our communities. So it's worth thinking of the COVID lens. I did and have reviewed the previous annual reports that came through to see if that statistic held outside of the lens of COVID. And what I found was that 20 to 21% of cases nationally are identified as self-neglect. So we saw an increase throughout the COVID period, but they hold steady nationally at around 20 to 21% anyway, around self-neglect. So let's think about the types of self-neglect and define some of those. So firstly, thinking about a lack of self-care, so an inability to meet basic care needs for that particular adult. So in terms of daily personal care, thinking about showering or bathing, cleaning teeth, brushing hair, but also thinking about that wider health approach and self-care. So thinking about healthy nutrition, exercise, and also social interaction of social needs being met. A lack of care or the lack of care around the home or domestic environment. So naturally, we would probably lean into thinking of overt signs such as hoarding or uncleanliness, but we need to think of that wider approach around lack of care of the home or domestic environment. So thinking about lack of access to facilities such as heating, running water and poor sanitation. And then we think about the wider impact on finances, so poor financial management potentially leading to those utilities for the care environment, the home environment being cut off. Refusal of support or services, now that could be statutory support or that could be community-led and community sector support and services, depending on the individual need of the adult. Failing to seek medical attention, so not meeting their medical needs or failing to attend medical appointments when they're scheduled, or in fact not scheduling those medical appointments when they need to. Failing to take appropriate medication for their care and support needs or their health. Hoarding, and when we think of hoarding, that could be items in the home, animals, or that could be both, again dependent on the individual. And we think more widely now around thinking about some eccentric behaviours or lifestyles that we might see that lead in and lean into self-neglect. So we know that these types of self-neglect that are evident on the screen and kind of explained then have an impact across all areas of an adult's life. So they're physical, they're social, they're environmental, and certainly significant health consequences that we'll see. So let's move on to thinking about the causes of self-neglect and some of the definitions around that. So firstly, we've got intentional, or often referred to as active self-neglect. So this is where an individual is of sound mind and body, but makes active choices. The individual may choose not to bathe, not to take necessary medications, or to clean or maintain their home, for example, even though they know reasonably that they should. These decisions may be an attempt at maintaining control. It could be a lifestyle choice, a personality type, or a reaction to a fear of institutionalization, so a fear of thinking they would go into a residential care home, for example. Even if the neglect, however, is intentional and active, given the fact that we live in a caring society, we can't simply dismiss those types of neglect, even though they are active or intentional choices by that particular adult. We still work with the adult with regards to that. The second cause of self-neglect that we need to think of is the non-intentional, often referred to as passive self-neglect. So typically these are caused by a decline in health. So again, physical health, mental or cognitive health, or could be as a result of addiction needs, learning needs, or by other life events or stressors that relate to trauma. So the individual adult doesn't understand what's happening because it's a passive self-neglect, but actually they don't make active choices, and the neglect in these cases tend to appear over time. So time builds up as a result of those life events or stressors, or those additional needs and declining needs. The other thing you'll see in grey there that I've highlighted on the slide is our need to always consider trauma and adversity and other vulnerabilities within the lens of self-neglect. So just some examples of that. So thinking about the early life experiences of that particular adult and the impact that we know that then has on the lifespan when they reach 18 plus. Experience or exposure to domestic abuse is another example of trauma and adversity. Our care experienced adults or our care leavers, so the experience of care within the local authority system, and particularly those adults that might utilise addiction as a coping mechanism for those earlier life experiences, and then that can lead to self-neglect in their later lives. I always caution when we talk about self-neglect and the lens in which that can be seen around clinical mental health difficulties. So nationally, we know that 30 to 50% of self-neglect cases where is documented where there is no existing clinical mental health disorder. So it's a myth that we need to break down with regards to mental health, clinical mental health always leading to self-neglect. We need to think more holistically about those additional vulnerability factors and the trauma and adversity lens in terms of experiences. It's also really important for us to consider the typical experience for that particular adult. So thinking about their history, what did their family life look like? What would their cultural views be within their family, in their community, and within their identity? And what are their social norms in terms of their lived experience of looking after themselves in terms of self-care? And again, just that reminder, that will be different for each individual that we see and that we support in the community. So we've explored the causes and we thought about some of the types of self-neglect that we might see in our community. But I really wanted to focus in on thinking about that impact. So what happens for our adults when they are experiencing self-neglect? Again, I go back to the point, this is going to be different for every individual, but some of the common themes that I've put on the slide here are ones that you'll see identified nationally in a lot of cases around self-neglect for adults. So firstly, thinking about escalation. So this is where we start to think without appropriate support or intervention, the health needs or challenges facing that particular adult increase, or they potentially become worse over time. Isolation, so the risk of isolation for that adult if they're self-neglecting significantly increases, and we've seen quite a high prevalence of that nationally with regards to hoarding cases, so significant isolation from family, friends and members of the community that could support that particular adult. Death or risk of fatality, so sadly this is our worst case scenario, but we need to understand that impact because of the safeguarding adult reviews we've seen nationally. We have seen deaths nationally due to self-neglect, either through that declined physical health, suicide, fire, or deaths due to the hoarding within the home as well, have seen deaths nationally for us. Significant impacts on relationships. So the impact is really far-reaching. So not just thinking about one pocket of relationships, but thinking about that big approach of the impact of family relationships, the impact of friends or peers, the impact of relationships within the community, and the impact on work for those adults that are employed and experiencing self-neglect. There's a significant risk to housing, so there's the potential risk of eviction, there's the increased risk of homelessness due to either the conditions of the property or financial difficulties, and ultimately there would always potentially be a risk of fire in cases where we see self-neglect around hoarding as well. The financial impact. So poor finance management could lead to debt issues, potentially go back to the eviction issues, repossession of homes for homeowners, or limited access to some of those basic home needs I was talking about around utilities and sanitation. And the last point is quite key in terms of some of the cases we've seen nationally. So thinking about that additional vulnerability in the community. So thinking about the risk of exploitation or additional vulnerabilities. So for example, the experience of mate crime by some of the adults that experience self-neglect. So just to touch on, these are the impacts on the adult themselves, but go back to Gibbons' definition that we opened with right at the start of the afternoon. So thinking about that wider impact on the community. So it isn't just the adult, it's the family, it's the friendship, and also the wider community impact that we need to consider when we think of impact. So moving on, so we've thought about the causes, the types and the impact. So what do we do next? We've identified that there's self-neglect issues for a particular adult that we're seeking to support. So the first bit in grey at the top there is our biggest thing that we need to focus on. So empathetic and compassionate conversations with the individual in question, reconnecting them back to their community. So thinking about rapport building, those relationships in the community and the services in the community that's available to them is our most important next step. Each individual's different, so one size doesn't fit all. So it needs to be really individual centered by having those really good compassionate conversations. And as Brené Brown, which is one of my best and loved kind of podcast or TED Talk speakers, Brené Brown always says empathy fuels connection. And that's what we need to seek to do with adults that are experiencing these particular needs. But we've also got our legislation to support our practice with regards to self-neglect. So we've got the Care Act 2014, our national statutory legislation with regards to the local authority, and that will be different for all of the areas. So for us, that would be Bristol City Council, for Bristol colleagues in the room. But thinking about the local authority being able to assess the care and support needs and think about what support would be needed for that particular adult. So that's our Section 9 of the Care Act. But also thinking about that wider safeguarding. So we've got this adult with care and support needs, but they're unable to safeguard themselves as a direct result of those care and support needs. So Section 42 is our safeguarding piece of legislation within the Care Act. And then we think of Section 11, so thinking about actually where the local authority would need to carry out an assessment to look at capacity, so the mental capacity of that adult, and thinking about best interest decisions. It's just worth noting here, given our legislation around the Care Act, that lots of self-neglect cases would not meet the threshold for the local authority to intervene, and we can still have good practice and support wrapped around that adult, regardless of whether there is local authority intervention. Every professional also has the right to disagree with each other. So we go back to embracing professional challenge and being critical friends with each other. And most partnership or safeguarding board areas will have an escalation policy to think about how we resolve professional differences when we don't agree with adult safeguarding themes. The Human Rights Act is our next piece of legislation. So that's the legislation that gives people the right to have the respect for a private and family life. However, whilst we have this piece of legislation, it's not an absolute right. There might be justification when we see self-neglect cases to think about overriding that. So just some examples around those justifications, thinking about the protection of health of the adult, prevention of crime, so safeguarding the public, and thinking about the protection and the rights of freedoms of others. So thinking about that wider impact on the community that Gibbons talks about within the definition. The Mental Capacity Act, often referred to as MCA of 2005, also is a really key factor we need to think about in terms of our practice when assessing self-neglect. I'm not able to cover all of the aspects of MCA today within this short webinar, but just some of the key questions we can start to ask ourselves when we support adults with self-neglect. So firstly, does the adult understand they are placing themselves at risk due to the self-neglect? Is the adult able to weigh up the alternative options? So being able to move around their accommodation, unhindered, being able to sleep in their bed, cook or use their kitchen, for example. This could also include weighing up the risk of not accepting that support. So thinking about that refusal, what might that lead to in terms of consequences of deterioration in health and potential hospital admission? Can the adult in question understand the information given over a period of time? And can they then act upon that information that we're giving them as a professional? And finally, for MCA, can the adult communicate their decision effectively? So those are the types of questions we need to start to think about when we think about applying MCA. The Housing Act 1998, so a landlord may have grounds to evict a tenant due to breaches of the tenancy agreement due to self-neglect issues, and particularly prevalent in some hoarding cases that we've seen. And the last point around guidance documents. So every area has its own local multi-agency guidance document for professionals regarding self-neglect, regarding MCA, the Mental Capacity Act, and also most partnerships have access to clutter tools or boards. It's important we really utilise that multi-agency guidance, because actually we come together as part of a multi-agency system to support that adult, regardless of which organisation we come from. And I will pop the multi-agency guidance links into the chat function at the end of the webinar when we come to questions and answers for everybody. The last point, I want us to reflect on ourselves. So we all have conscious bias about what we consider appropriate self-care and appropriate living conditions. So therefore, to check and test ourselves and to not bring bias or judgment to the table, to come with empathy and compassion, we need to make sure we assess together in that multi-agency system approach. We need to think of the clinical approach, the social approach, and ethical decision making within that. So an example of where I think of check and testing our bias, a lived experience example that one of my colleagues that co-produces with me gave, was thinking about a particular adult that, say, maybe only baths or showers once a week. Now, we might be thinking, that's not my personal self-care routine, or that's not how I would live. So that's about us check and testing ourselves with regards to that bias and judgment culture, because it could be that adult is making an active choice in that, or it could be that the support service at the time can only tend to their needs at that point. We have to be really uncomfortable in and check and test our bias and judgment culture. So get comfortable with being uncomfortable and have those conversations. So what next? So we've thought about identifying, we've thought about guidance documents, and we've thought about our legislation. So what can we do in terms of good practice? Before I move on to thinking about good practice, I just want to recognise some of the barriers. So just to say out loud that actually working with self-neglect cases can be alarming and challenging for professionals, especially in cases where that adult might refuse support or is unable to recognise the concerns that we hold as a professional. This becomes further complicated in cases where that threshold for statutory intervention from our local authorities isn't met. And sometimes we've seen in previous cases that can lead to ineffective decision making, lesser interventions, or certainly lesser confidence within interventions. The confidence around MCA, the Mental Capacity Act, has previously sometimes led to inaction or inappropriate action being taken due to that lack of knowledge and confidence around applying those principles. However, we can overcome those barriers that I've just touched on by thinking about the good practice nationally that you can see here on the slide. And I'm just going to work my way through some of those with you on this particular slide. So thinking about the relationship-based working being the most important bit of our work. So thinking about being trauma-informed in our practice, taking a really compassionate and empathetic approach, but also taking the time to build rapport. So relationship-based working takes time. It takes time to build rapport. Thinking about co-production around decision making is key. So the adult being at the heart of that decision making. We'll look more in depth on the next slide around thinking around our safeguarding principles and our trauma-informed approach principles. But what are some of the long-term interventions that we might see with adults? So I'm thinking about adult occupational therapy, domiciliary care, housing and environmental health services, community or voluntary services that could wrap around the adult, police intervention, drug and alcohol service for those with addiction needs, GPs, secondary mental health services, the RSPCA, so thinking about animal welfare in the property, the fire service and welfare benefit advice around that financial implication. All of these are long-term interventions with relationship-based working that can seek to support self-neglect. So the voice of lived experience and advocacy. So for me, if I bring that back to basics, it's about hearing a day in the life of. That adult is going to be the best source of information to tell you what their lived experience is. It should be the foundation and core of any intervention and support. So those dynamic and rich conversations with the adult go back to that fuel and empathy fuels connection. Thinking about their history, their past and current life, alongside checking that within the multi-agency system. Advocacy is really, really important for adults. It helps us hear their truth and is especially important in those cases where adults might lack capacity and we might need to share their truth on their behalf and advocate for their voice if they lack capacity. Good multi-agency structures. So we need to see that at both an operational level and also a strategic level. So thinking about how we share information with each other, how we plan, we come with really good action planning, but with the adult in question. So they're the centre again of that decision making. Thinking about the fact we're going to need an allocated coordinator role, regardless of whether there's local authority intervention within that case. And we need then that to be supported strategically. So that would be supported strategically by our local safeguarding adult boards or our local safeguarding partnerships, depending on how your area functions. Good policy and guidance. So I've already touched on the fact that all of our areas have a local guidance and policy document to support our thinking around self-neglect within the multi-agency system. And I mentioned earlier, I will pop those into the chat at the end of the presentation. A good understanding of the Mental Capacity Act, so MCA, and implementing that in the right way. So what I would say is that assessment is really key to inform self-neglect and to think about how we support that adult moving forward. It should never be a justification for inaction in terms of self-neglect. Go back to my point earlier around having a caring society that we live in. And local authority and partnerships offer either single agency or interagency training to support that confidence. And for my Bristol colleagues in the room, we are offering MCA interagency training at present for the workforce in Bristol. Clear record keeping. So thinking about how we record our interventions, how we record the decisions we've made, but we also record our rationales for that. So thinking about why we take an action or why we don't take an action, and involving the adult within that, because those adults could have the right to read those record backs and understand their support and lived experience. Managing pressures from others. So within self-neglect cases, we're going to face pressures from family members, friends and peers of that particular adult, the adult themselves potentially, other professionals within the safeguarding system, and especially the community in terms of that wider impact. So we need to manage expectations really carefully, and manage those pressures within the system is really key. Training is really important. So go back to that point that I recognised earlier and reflected that self-neglect is a complex safeguarding concern for practitioners to be supporting adults within the community. So we need to ensure as partnership areas that we're offering appropriate training to equip the workforce that are supporting adults directly with the skills and confidence to put this into practice. And robust supervision, whether that's one-to-one with a manager or that peer-on-peer supervision and debrief, is really vital in supporting that ongoing challenge and complexity around self-neglect cases. And the last point I've already touched on, but I will highlight it again. It's really healthy and constructive when we embrace professional challenge when working with self-neglect cases. Healthy challenge of each other within the safeguarding system is really key to ensuring the best outcomes for adults. I touched on the fact that most areas have an escalation policy within that area, so please familiarise yourself with that. We need to be able to be a critical friend with each other within the safeguarding system, but also hearing that feedback loop from the community, from the adult and the community themselves, to make sure that our practice is as good as it can be to achieve the right outcomes. So good practice. So think about the right approach. So you'll see here on the left of the slide, I've put down some things that, having spoken to adults in the community, they've told me might be the barriers. So when we make that approach to them, what might they be feeling? So a sense of pride, a sense of fear. And when I touch on fear, that could encompass a wide variety of fear, but particularly I'm thinking in particular around our adults that have addiction needs. It's our biggest conscious bias and judgment point around addiction in our areas. How do we break down that bias and judgment? But also that adult could be fearing that their drug or alcohol that they're using as a coping mechanism could be removed from that professional. Not wanting to conform. They could be feeling a sense of loss, so loss of people in their lives, that sense of loss of control, or that sense of loss of self or identity. They could be mistrusting of professionals, particularly if they've not had a positive experience within the safeguarding system previously or with a particular organisation. And we need to always think about other mental health needs, so self-harm. These are some of the things adults might be feeling when we seek to approach them and offer the support that we want to offer. So a trauma-informed and a safeguard.
Natalie, you've just gone on to mute.
Thank you. I don't know why it keeps doing that. So where did it get to, Sarah?
You just started talking about trauma-informed.
Thank you, Sarah. So a trauma-informed and safeguarding approach that's individual-centred, least intrusive is the right approach and helps to overcome some of those feelings that you'll see on the slide when we approach that adult in question. So the two pink bubbles that you can see on the screen highlight our core trauma-informed and safeguarding-informed principles for adults that we would see in good practice across all of our areas. So when we think about safety, how are you able to offer a supportive, safe and nurturing environment for this adult that promotes physical, emotional and psychological safety when they then feel able to discuss their self-neglect needs? Choice. So by working with adults and giving them choice, we support that feeling of pride, we overcome that fear and that sense of loss and support them not being able to feel that loss of control. Choice can be difficult because sometimes we have to accept as professionals that adults have the ability to make unwise choices when they have capacity and are making those active self-neglect choices. That can be difficult, but they have the right to make that choice and to autonomy. Collaboration and partnership. So decision making with the individual, not done to the individual. There would naturally always be a power dynamic at play when a professional intervenes in an adult life. We have to accept that. But by enabling the adult to be an equal partner and be an active decision maker, that enables that trauma-informed approach. Partnership also includes hearing the voice of the family, so that wider approach, and the community around that adult, as well as the truth of the adult in question. Trust and accountability. So offering consistency, reliability, maintaining healthy boundaries, but taking the time to build that trust and rapport. If you say you're going to do something, follow through on it. Goes back to safeguarding being everyone's responsibility across the system and the adult being clear about what they can expect from us as professionals supporting them. Empowerment. So recognising that all adults will have their own individual skills, they'll have different areas of resilience, but actually it's really empowering, cultivate that empowerment in their life. But step back and acknowledge the adult's skills at every stage and at every contact with them, making support personal to each adult and asking the adult what they want the outcome to be. So what would you see the support looking like? What would the outcome be for you? Because again, that's going to be different for each individual. Inclusivity. So Bristol have included this within their work and a lot of other partnership areas have embraced that as well. So the ability to actively seek to end oppression, exclusion and address inequality. So this is about our ability to recognise the diverse needs of every adult we may work with, understand that lens of their lived experience and identity, because again, identity will be different for everyone, and understand the impact of society and trauma histories for them. When I refer to identity, it's also particularly important to think about the lens in which the area that we might be supporting that adult. So thinking about the fact that there will be substantial differences for members of our urban community versus our rural community, and also the experiences of disadvantage and less visible populations of our community. It's important we don't lose sight of that. Prevention and protection. So this goes back to thinking about raising awareness within our teams, within our workforces, equipping our workforces and our practitioners that are supporting adults in the cities and in our rural communities around self-neglect issues, but also ensuring that our adults in our communities know where they can go to get that help. Where is that support and help available, and what's going to happen next with them on that journey? We explain that as we walk them through it. Proportionality. So I go back to the point about this being the least intrusive way to intervene in an adult's life. So it's that balance of respecting the individual, coming with that trauma-informed approach, but also needing to balance safeguarding and thinking about how we keep them safe and support their self-neglect issues. It's important we don't see the support for adults experiencing self-neglect as a quick fix. So you'll see that visual aid on the screen. It's not a quick fix. It's about long-term relationship building, least intrusive intervention-based approach done with adults, not to them. Elsie's story from our community care group is a really good example of professionals doing to an adult, and I will pop the link in the chat at the end for people that want to read that after the particular at the end of the session. So I'm going to move on now to looking at that case study. So just again, a self-care reminder for everybody. This is a lived experience example as a result of a safeguarding adult review. I'm going to open with explaining the particulars of the case, and then I will move over from the PowerPoint slide onto a Slido poll, which is where I ask for your audience participation, and I will share that visually on the screen for you all. But let's look at Matthew's experience and the particulars of Matthew's case. So Matthew's SAAW was published in 2021, so December 2021. But what was Matthew's experiences? So Matthew was 44 when he died in January 2018 as a result of significant deterioration in his health linked to self-neglect. His ethnicity was white British. At the time of his death, he had been living in a town in Somerset since at least 2008, latterly in a ground floor flat that he rented from a social housing provider. Although little is known about his history before he came into contact with local health and social care services in Somerset. Matthew had type 2 diabetes, and his height to weight ratio would have been classified medically as obese at the time of his death. He was also known to be a very heavy smoker. Matthew had a history of substance misuse and a personality disorder, as well as severe physical issues connected with his weight, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, known as COPD, and skin infections. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing there and move over to the Slido poll. If you can bear with me as I do that. So if everybody's either happy to scan the QR code that you can see visible on the screen, or you can join at slido.com using the room code there. But I want people to be able to populate on the screen. What would be your initial thoughts for Matthew's case? I can see people type in at the top of the screen, which is great. All of this is anonymous, but it will just populate on the screen. So isolated, yeah. Complex case, yeah. So lots of worries for Matthew. Complex, so the larger the wording, more people are suggesting that. Sad. Why was he not picked up before in terms of that early intervention considerations? Health not being properly addressed. So thinking about so lonely, would it have been lonely for him? I imagine, yeah. So complex, we've got some more. So multi-layered is the other word. So yeah, thinking about those different worries that we'd have for Matthew and the different layers of his health needs. Complex, sad, vicious cycle, someone's put, yeah. So we might struggle with his engagement. Yeah, absolutely. So complex is the one that keeps coming up time and time again. He's really vulnerable, high needs, thinking about what support we might have been able to get him the diabetes review. I'll let people continue typing. I'll just continue reading some of them out as they come up. So thinking about that trauma lens people have touched on. Where was his support network? So thinking about where holistically was that support coming from, either from professionals or the community. And we will go back to that in terms of his support system. So probably been written off by services. So thinking that multi-layered approach in terms of how do we intervene? How do we do that right for Matthew? Yeah. The role of housing. So yeah, thinking about actually the role we might play if we're from a housing background for those of you in the room within this particular case and others. Lack of trust. So we've got complex coming up time and time again. So thinking he was quite young at the point of his death. Yeah, really sadly, he was very young, wasn't he? Okay, I'm going to pause there. We will come back. I can see lots of people are typing, so thank you for your engagement. I really appreciate your participation within this. We will come back more, but it looks like complex, lonely and vulnerable and thinking about capacity seem to be the larger kind of overarching general thoughts from everybody in the room. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing that a second. We will come back to that, but I'm going to go back to sharing the presentation and thinking about the next element of Matthew's case. Bear with me. Oh, Wynne or Sarah, can you just confirm that's come back on the screen for me? That would be really helpful.
Yeah, it's there.
Thank you, appreciate that. So thinking about the key highlights, so the next 2 slides, we're going to look at some more information about Matthew's case and some of the particulars that were found in the review period within the SAAW, the Safeguarding Adult Review. So Matthew declined support with managing his physical and mental health conditions at home, but also within the hospital environment. And just before his death, he declined hospital admittance shortly before his death. Matthew's wife died from cancer a number of years before his death. From background information, she appeared to have been a moderating influence on him with regards to his health and nutrition, and that the loss of her influence had a significant impact on Matthew's health. Professionals reported that Matthew could at times display threatening or aggressive behaviour, and that was towards professionals. Matthew received domiciliary care in his home, but he did express concerns about the service, so his voice. Professionals arranged support in the community for Matthew, but he was unable to make those support sessions in person. They were outside of his home within certain environments in the community. Matthew was deemed by professionals to have capacity. So if we go back to thinking around our Mental Capacity Act considerations, but the first formal MCA, mental capacity assessment, was undertaken 1 month before his death. So quite in quick succession to his loss. Matthew's social worker left post, and Matthew was not allocated a dedicated worker within the local authority, albeit he did remain open to the local authority at the time. Matthew's contact during that period dropped very significantly. 3 months before his death, Matthew was the victim of a burglary in his property as he'd left the door unlocked and was then unable to get out of bed when he was the victim of that burglary. There were professional differences about the cause of Matthew's self-neglect and funding to support his needs around his self-neglect. Matthew had a dog that was extremely important to him. Matthew was clear he did not want his family involved within his care. That was his voice. Much of the review of Matthew's care and support around his self-neglect needs was done via single agency reviews rather than that multi-agency coordinated approach. And that was especially heightened during those crisis or acute periods with his health. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing there, and I will go back to the Slido poll. So again, I will ask for your contributions, please. I'd really appreciate that, everybody. So now we've heard a little bit more information. The question I wanted people to join this time, either scan the QR code or join again at Slido. So the next question, did professionals miss anything? What are your thoughts around Matthew's case and considering that, what you've heard? His grief, yeah, so the significant loss of his wife. We know that that had a significant impact on him experiencing grief, but then his own health and development and being able to meet his needs. So strengths. So was focusing on his strengths. So was he offered bereavement support? Joint working, that need for the multi-agency approach, yeah, rather than that single agency approach. So rapport building, going back to that relationship approach we were talking about, absolutely. Joint working, yep, someone feels very passionately about that. We've got lots of exclamation marks, which is good. Communication, so how do we communicate with Matthew, but how do we communicate with each other? Advocacy, yeah, how do we hear his voice in that? Was he just so bereavement and a multidisciplinary team approach needed? Yeah, just trying to break down the barrier of what MDT might mean. So working together, yeah. Thinking about, again, housing and the approach housing, a lack of care review. Yeah, the risk not linked, so not joining up the dots and all the pieces of the jigsaw that we would have needed to for Matthew, similarly for other adults. Too little, too late. So thinking about, did we intervene early enough for Matthew? And should we intervene early enough for other cases that we might come across with self-neglect? Okay, I can see a couple more people typing. So the care plan not personalised. So thinking, go back to that individual-centred approach. Someone's touched on thinking about empathy again. So joining with empathy, joining with logic with adults that we see in systemic practice. Prevention, yeah. So how could we have intervened and looked at prevention and supporting Matthew? Absolutely. Building the relationship, yeah. Okay, just pause. It seems like communication and thinking about that impact of grief and bereavement and that significant loss. Was he were concerns about his agent? Were the concerns about his care agency discussed? Yep, they were discussed from reading the Safeguarding Adult Review. Yeah, just to reiterate that for everybody. So missed opportunities, I can see people putting there as well, and needing to think about that approach together. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to pause there just because I'm mindful we are running out of time, and we will come back to the final thought process. But thank you again, everybody, for participating in that. And I will go back now to the slideshow just to finalise our thinking around Matthew's case and prompt our thinking around other cases that we might need to support. Okay. So just to finalise our learning, so you'll see here on the left, these were the multi-agencies that were involved. So you'll see there were 8 agencies at the point involved in Matthew's case on the left. And on the right, I've listed the recommendations that came out. So these were 7 formal recommendations that came out of Matthew's case as a result of that safeguarding adult review. So the capacity to support people that had been living in the community into a care home setting. So Matthew was offered access to come into residential care home setting to support his self-neglect and his self-care, but there was an issue around equipment and the appropriate equipment being available. There was issues around funding, so thinking about that professional difference of opinion around the cause of Matthew's self-neglect, but thinking about how we strengthen that knowledge within the safeguarding system around funding processes. So thinking about where that money might come from to support Matthew's care or care similarly for other adults. So we always see this time and time again, don't we, in reviews, but thinking about the voice of the adult affected. So how did we truly hear Matthew's voice? You've all touched on thinking about what he might have been thinking around the loss of his wife. We see, don't we, that he finds his dog extremely important to him. That would have been a snapshot of his voice, being able to understand that. But what outcome would Matthew want? We need to have those conversations to help understand that. And balance of human rights. So you all touched on would best interest decisions. So Matthew was assessed to have capacity, but how do we balance his right to have a private life versus the fact that there was substantial risks with his health associated with that? And that's when we start to think about our best interest decisions. Thinking about how we share worries within the multi-agency system. So you all touched on in the feedback, thinking about that single agency approach doesn't achieve the best outcomes for our adults. We need to come together in the system, share, but also escalate concerns and worries, be able again to be that critical friend with each other within the system to support Matthew's case or similarly for other adults. Promotion of routes outside of local authority intervention. So I go back to that point that not all self-neglect cases will reach that threshold for local authority intervention, but how do we still wrap around that adult and offer that individual-centred approach for them? Thinking about our Mental Capacity Act consideration, so MCA, we need that to be really robust. When we think about that, we assess that and we record our decision making with regards to that as well. There wasn't a lead professional identified to coordinate within Matthew's case, but how do we make sure that happens for Matthew and other cases moving forward, that coordination approach within that multi-agency system? And the last point was around the fact that Matthew didn't want his family involved in his care, and he was very isolated. So what policies do we have in our local area around practice to support independent advocacy? So we still hear the truth of that adult, but that's an independent person within the community that can support. Particularly important when we think about crisis or acute points where that adult might fluctuate with their capacity and supporting that, because that's what we saw in Matthew's case. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the Slido polls for you all, and I want one last interaction, please, if that's okay. So I just want to hear your thoughts now on the learning. So you've heard the learning from Matthew's case and those recommendations about how we not just support Matthew, but other cases moving forward. So what are your thoughts on that learning and the recommendations? And I've just brought that Slido poll up for everyone to engage with that one, please. What does that provoke? So thinking about Matthew's needs, yeah, absolutely. Really need to act, yeah. Ensure that multidisciplinary approach. So again, that coming together, person-centered, yeah. So individual, what works for one individual won't work for everybody. We need to be individual focused. Importance of joint working, repeat patterns of learning. Yep, sadly we do see in some of our statutory reviews those repeat kind of recommendations coming back. His voice to be heard, yeah, absolutely. Person-centered is coming up more and more. So there's a response there around kind of vague learning points. So I suppose the question there is about how do we take that back to practice if in general in all of our areas. Assertive outreach, so yeah, thinking about the fact that Matthew necessarily wouldn't have been able to make those appointments. How do we come to Matthew? How do we take that approach? Importance of multidisciplinary working, yeah, communication, joint working. So why didn't practice change? Yeah. Voice of the client, so thinking about all service user. I know a lot of people within the adult safeguarding system use service user, but voice of the adult, it could happen again, yeah, potentially, yeah, and that's why we're thinking about Stop Adult Abuse Week and thinking about this theme of safeguarding, about how we can prevent that and how we can go back to our good practice and supporting similar cases to Matthew moving forward. Okay, so it seems to come up, the main themes coming up are person-centered communication, that multi-agency approach, and some of those repeat issues that sadly we're seeing within our statutory reviews across all of our areas. So how do we, my challenge back would be, how do we make sure that we achieve good practice in our areas to seek to prevent this happening again for adults? Okay. I am going to stop there and pause because I am mindful I'm very quickly running out of time, and I've got a couple more slides left to share with you all. So bear with me and I will finalise the session for you all, and then we'll move over to our questions and answers. So we touched on earlier throughout the presentation the use of our local guidance documents being good practice. So each partnership area I've touched on has its own. So those are the links in this, and I will put them into the chat function shortly, so you've got them for takeaway as well. But just a final thought to end the webinar and for you to leave with after you've done your evaluation forms, please, and the question and answer. So you've heard today in the webinar presentation I've given how adults experience self-neglect, the causes and types, and the impact that we see on not just the adult, but the family, support systems around them and the community. And then we've thought about how we come with a trauma-informed, individual-centred approach that is least intrusive for that adult. So you'll see a magic wand on the screen. If you had a magic wand like you can see on the screen today, we'd like you to take away and think about what could be done differently in your community. So you've heard all of that and you've heard the learning from Matthew's case. What could be done differently in your community with regards to your practice? And I'll leave you with that final question and thought. So we're going to go over to the question and answers now. So I'm going to end screen sharing. And if Sarah, if you could pause the recording, just so colleagues have got the opportunity to ask any informal questions.